Right. So picking up with the establishment of Qing Dynasty China here, um, the end of the Ming Dynasty is going to come about with a disenchantment, really, of the lower classes, social classes in Ming China. So there's going to be a series of peasant rebellions and ethnic strife that begin to grip and spread across the countryside. From this, you have these tribal banner armies beginning to rise up, mostly coming out of what is today Manchuria, the Manchurian steppe, under the overall authority of a man named Nurhaci. He's going to organize the military forces in that region under these banners and sweep out of Manchuria southward across what is today China. Over time, this kind of ethnic population would become known as Manchu, and it's Nurhaci's son that is going to formally establish the Qing dynasty in 1644, and it would last until 1911. As far as kind of characteristics of the this new dynasty were concerned, you have actually the Qing rulers and this Manchu ethnicity adopting many of the Han Chinese governing and administrative traditions. The Han Chinese were another ethnic group within the formal boundaries of China during this period of time, and now they were being supplanted by the Manchu. They, in many cases, the Manchu worked to cultivate actually good relations with the Han Chinese. There was a continued respect for and observance of Confucian philosophy, uh, and this was actually disseminated to a greater degree to the commoners in society via public lectures primarily. So that the idea here being that if people know how to live ethical lives, that this will benefit the overall running of government and state affairs because people will know, you know, what the right thing to do is. There would also be a continuation of the civil service examination system that had been put into effect under the Ming Dynasty. This again would be tiered into three different levels: local, provincial, and national or metropolitan um, categories. Now, what is interesting is that under Qing Dynasty China, that the number of governing positions available to fill was obviously fixed, but the number of people entering into and qualifying via these exams for state appointments exceeded the number of offices that needed to be filled. So as a result, you have a rise in kind of a professional class within China who became teachers and scholars, which is going to help enrich the kind of social and political characteristics the state under the Qing dynasty. You might say uh, that this is an early example of civil society beginning to emerge. Now, the same thing is happening in a different way, arguably, in places like Europe, but nonetheless, that there is kind of this enrichment taking place. Militarily speaking, the Manchu are going to maintain the banner-like structure of the military. They're going to be called banner armies, organized into these large eight large armies themselves. They would mostly be populated and by Manchu troops, with Han Chinese troops acting as auxiliary units to the main core of Manchu manpower. As far as agricultural advancements are concerned, you have under Qing Dynasty a faster ripening strain of rice that is going to have key um, consequences and, in this case, beneficial effects for the population under the Qing Dynasty's control. Specifically, this new strain is going to be able to ripen in just a 30-day cycle, so that you're able to harvest this new grain, this new strain of rice, that much more quickly, which means that you're getting more yield per arable acre without having to expand the number of acres that you're sowing with the crop, because the turnaround time for the growth cycle is so much more accelerated. This helped meet the demands of a rapidly growing population. I think hopefully you recall from our last focus on China that the population was doubling roughly from 100 million to 200 million over the course of the several hundred years of Qing Dynasty rule. That number would again double to 300 million. So it was imperative that they find the food resources necessary to, you know, handle this influx of population. There would also be a very, you might say, pronounced or cultural practices that are beginning to take place. Two of these in particular are foot binding, which Manchu Chinese culture began to put into effect, where there was a kind of a foot fetish of sorts, where Chinese men would find it kind of exotic to have women with small feet. So this would lead to a practice where women would be, from essentially childbirth, would be put into these very small shoes, and as their bodies grew, their feet would be grotesquely kind of malformed to keep their feet small. Essentially, you would have, roughly using a hand here as a representation, you have kind of the growth plate where the toes would come into the foot. Well, what would happen is that the toes would curl under the foot itself and essentially render Chinese women immobile. That their feet would be so small that once they reached mature womanhood, that their feet couldn't balance their weight on these small, painfully misshapen feet as a result of this practice. So this is kind of a cultural norm that was put into effect. Also, there was the practice among Chinese men to have a shaved head with a long braided queue of hair coming off either the crown of the head or the kind of back quadrant of the skull. In Tokugawa Japan, there's going to also be a need for consolidating hereditary rule, especially under the Tokugawa family. We talked about how they established themselves, kind of bringing Japan out of this prolonged period of the Warring States era. And as they began to lay out the foundations for a social political system, they found themselves kind of creating a tiered a three-tiered feudal-like structure. Uh, the first of these was known as the Shinpan. These were local feudal lords that were most loyal to the Tokugawa family. They would either be extended family members of the Tokugawa or very close allies running back decades and generations. They would be responsible for governing the provinces in and around Edo, the capital under the Tokugawa system, to help safeguard, the capital itself, because they were the most trusted to do so. Next in this ranking system came what were known as the Fudai. These lords were loyal to the family prior to their rise to power, kind of on the eve of their ascension to power, and they would be responsible for governing the provinces, the next circle of provinces farther out from the capital. The lowest on this kind of scale of feudal governors or lords was that of the Tozama. These lords were kind of the newest allies that had proclaimed their loyalty to the Tokugawa family after they had come to power, and they would oversee the running of provinces farthest from the center. Now, what's also interesting here is that the Tokugawa family expected and required that these lords of all ranks would be spending part of the year, part of their time in Edo, so that the idea was that the Tokugawa rulers would be able to keep closer tabs on all of their subordinate lords and nobles, but also at the same time they would be receiving information on how any types of events or problems that were being experienced throughout the expanse of the Tokugawa realm. Also, these lords and nobles were required to spend rather lavishly on their personal lifestyles. This would mean not only in the decor of their residences, and because they were spending part of their time in Edo, they would be responsible for not only maintaining a household in the provinces where they governed part of the year, but they'd also be responsible for maintaining estates in Edo, in the city of Edo itself, which required healthy sums of money. They would also be required to entertain members of the Tokugawa family if they themselves were moving about the countryside, and these lords and nobles would be required to spend lavishly on personal attire. So again, this is an intentional effort to keep these rivals, potential rivals, in check as far as keeping them poor in many cases, so that they would not be able to amass a war chest that could be used to fund any type of military action against the Tokugawa family itself. As far as political characteristics were concerned in the Tokugawa system, we're talking about an era that was predominantly conservative, that would be also practice a high degree of seclusion or isolation. Now, what's interesting is in a moment we'll talk about how the first Tokugawa leader, Tokugawa Ieyasu, went about trying managing, we'll say, the contact that Japan had with the wider world. But by the end of this lecture, you'll also see kind of the reversal of those policies, begin to take place after Tokugawa Ieyasu's death. So it's important again to understand that it was Ieyasu himself who was calling the shots and determining the measure of contact that Japan would have with the outside world, when and where this would happen, with whom it would happen, and that it was very closely guarded and managed. There would also be a focus again on Confucian ethics in good governance, and also a healthy respect paid to Japanese antiquity. Kind of this idea, again, you might say, of a preservation of identity in the eyes of Japanese culture. Economically speaking, the early Tokugawa era is going to see a pretty substantial economic growth begin to take place here. This is going to be most evident in the rise of a merchant class within the Tokugawa society. There's going to be also, along with this, a shift, a transition from a rice-based economy, kind of a barter economy, to a actual coin or money-based system of exchange and economy. So you see a greater sophistication of the economic system itself throughout Japan during this period of time, during the early stages of Tokugawa rule. And the merchant class actually, by the mid 17th century, the mid 1600s, is going to really come to the fore. This is something we'll address and discuss in greater detail on the other side of our first exam here, but just kind of something to keep in mind. There's going to be an improvement in the standard of living that takes place as a result of this economic growth. There would be population growth, as you might expect, with a good economy, and there would again be of this vibrant merchant class that would be driving it all. As far as cultural growth is concerned, with this new merchant class, with the wealth that was beginning to emerge across Japan, these merchants would begin to fuel and support new interests, revived interests in religion, the arts, and literature. With regard to religion, there's going to be a kind of a profound worship of Shintoism as it began to eclipse long established traditions of Buddhism in Japan, but also it would outpace Christianity. Now, part of the reason for that is because the relations between the Japanese people as a whole and Christianity was going to sour, as we'll see in a few moments. So this kind of opened and allowed for the healthy preservation of Shintoist practices. Again, where Shintoism being where people see the Japanese emperor, who is really nothing more than a figurehead, but one that is regarded as a spiritual kind of god on earth that we've seen across civilizations that we've studied thus far. Japan was no real exception, and Shintoism is the expression of that. There would also be the introduction of haiku, or the haiku, which is a short form of poetry. This is basically two lines of text with, I believe, 17 syllables. So it's very formulaic and structured as far as what qualifies as haiku writing, but it was very kind of snappy prose that took root during this period of time and is with us even today. There was interest in reading and writing of novels in Japan, and also there was an interest in kabuki performances during this period of time as well. So there's a healthy respect paid to kind of cultural enrichment that coincide with this economic growth by and large. As for relations with outsiders, particularly in this case European arrivals that were beginning to move about in the Pacific, Tokugawa Ieyasu, the first of the Tokugawa era, uh, befriended actually Spanish missionaries in as early as 1602, and by 1610 had ratified and formalized relations with these Spanish missionaries. Uh, Even after that period of time, however, there were few traders that came to Japan. Part of this is probably because the Japanese society as a whole did not see much value in trading or purchasing European goods or the goods that Europeans offered. And so they didn't get much traction commercially in Japan itself. Nonetheless, there was contact that was established. In 1609, the Dutch would succeed in establishing a trading post in western Japan. Again, this was at the personal invitation of Tokugawa Ieyasu. This invitation actually was obtained by an English pilot of a Dutch vessel that was shipwrecked on the shores of Japan. That English pilot was a man by the name of Will Adams, and he would become the character around which Jim Clavel's book Shogun, which he wrote in the, I guess it was the 1960s or 1970s, as a piece of historical fiction, kind of offered up this very romanticized view of this the experiences that this Will Adams had as he was kept within Japanese society, and his kind of negotiating through that cultural interplay between West and East. Um, Again, that's the novel itself. Using that character is fiction, but the person on which it's based actually did exist. Um, in 1612, Ieyasu is actually going to begin to pull back from interactions with the outside world. He's going to order the crackdown of on Christian missionaries in Japan. This came largely as a result of his realizing that Japan could trade with Europe without having to take on the trappings of Christianity itself. That is, that uh, they didn't have to convert to Christianity in order to do business with Europeans. And so once Ieyasu came to that realization, he began to uh, restrict the avenues through which Christianity tried to proselytize and spread its faith. So here we have a pretty good example of Japan wanting to, in some cases, do trade with outsiders, but do so on their own terms. That they didn't want to basically, have to conform to the outside world as far as standards or kind of cultural practices or norms. They wanted to interact with the world as they to the extent that they wanted to, rather than having to have a zero sum kind of all or nothing type of relationship. By 1617, just 5 years later, these conditions would worsen. There would be executions and deportations of Catholic missionaries. What's interesting is that this happens the year after Aisu's death. So one may hypothesize that this was the result of a period of transition within the Japanese state, and so therefore there is this kind of natural aversion to outsiders, seen as being a threat, a potential source for extending influence, and so therefore there's this kind of reactionary type of suppression of those populations of the Christian and Catholic missionaries. As power did begin to consolidate, as the after Aisu's death, as the dust began to kind of settle, there would be actually a formal reversal of Aisu's policies, where attention would be paid to consolidating control after his death, as covered, but also there would be this consistent rollback as far as Japan's interactions with outsiders. This began as early as 1623, where English traders, English merchants were ordered to leave Japan. The following year, Spanish merchants were forced out. In 1636, the Japanese followed in the footsteps of China, where they outlawed ocean. They forbid Japanese citizens from traveling abroad. They outlawed the construction of ocean-going vessels. And 2 years later, in 1638, the Portuguese were forced out. And when they actually tried to return in 1640, they were rounded up and executed. It was only the Dutch and the Chinese who were allowed to stay, trade openly, but they were only allowed to trade in certain ports, and their movements and their activities were closely monitored by the Tokugawa state. So again, it was Tokugawa Japan that was dictating all the terms of trade, and exacting all these conditions on any type of opening to others. And that's again characteristic of all this autocratic power that is beginning to take place. You have these very reactionary tendencies, not only in Tokugawa Japan, to the degree where they begin to shut the door to outside influence, but also in Russia, where there's this constant attention paid to repressing or suppressing the plight of along not only social ranks, domestic social ranks, primarily nobles and serfs, but also externally with regard to relations with Swedes and Poles most immediately. In China, you might say that the transition during this period of time was perhaps more gradual, more accommodating. It's not to say that there was an absence of violence. I mean, there certainly was a healthy degree of conflict taking place as they transitioned from the Ming Dynasty to the Qing Dynasty. But at the very least, you might say there was this the Manchu that came to power were willing to acknowledge at the very least the successes that the Han had experienced under the Ming Dynasty, and they were willing to incorporate those characteristics, those kind of successes, and the effective administration of government they were willing to perpetuate that under the Qing dynasty and show a degree of acceptance and learning, absorbing um, the the successes of that the Ming Chinese had attained for themselves. To a degree, you might see parallels of that in other empires and other societies that we've studied to date. It'll be something to kind of keep in mind as we again move forward, with our investigation of world history up to the modern era. All right, so I'm going to leave it there. I'll be posting, like I said, believe at the end of the 30 Years War lecture, I'll be giving about probably at least an hour talk, hopefully, on strategies and tips for preparing for our first exam. That should be up either in very shortly, and so look forward to that. And we'll get some discussion. I'll continue again with looking at discussion questions and providing feedback as well. All right.